so glad I loaded the audience with all my friends. Thank you very much. Yes, so I'm going to talk to you about what is digital capital and why should you care. As Brett said, I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships here at Moodle, but this is not about my role at Moodle, this is about my research. I'm also a doctoral researcher with the University of Bath here in the UK, and I'm really interested in the outcomes from higher education and the value of higher education with a social equity kind of focus. So I'm a first-generation higher education graduate myself, and I spent 20 years working in universities before I joined Moodle. So that's where I'm coming from with this work. I'm not going to be talking specifically about Moodle, so I'm just going to let you all know that right now. But the two talks that come after me are all about Moodle, so you should stay and listen to those guys. What I'm going to do is just introduce you to the concept of digital capital, which has really helped me think about how learners with different backgrounds might experience online learning differently. And my hope is that those of you in the room who are actively working with learners today, who are building courses in Moodle, who are designing learning environments and learning scenarios, will be able to take this work on to the next stage and maybe find some interesting ways to develop it and use it in your practice. So I'm going to start. I've got lots of italics that I didn't have earlier. Apologies for the noise on the slide. I'm going to talk about the sort of key principles of a good online course from my perspective. And so we all have different frameworks, of course, that we use when we're designing good online learning. And you can see here the very clear disclaimer that this is my personal opinion. But I thought in order to talk about how learners might experience our courses differently, I needed to start with the foundation for me of what makes a good online learning course. And so this is based on academic research, and it's kind of contextualized with my experience as a learning designer and an educator. And so for me, a good online course is learner-centered in that it addresses individual needs and leverages learner experiences and interests. It gives the learner agency, situating them as an active and self-directed participant in the creation of knowledge. And it has strong teaching presence, regardless of whether a teacher is actually present. So it may be slightly harder, but I think most of you working in this space know that you can have really great teaching presence, even if your course is entirely asynchronous, and that's an important part of the design work that you do. And it builds a sense of community between learners. So the research shows that student success in online learning courses may be heavily, or probably is heavily influenced by the participation, engagement, and social interaction that is generated between learners. So we build a good online course following these principles. Everyone should be able to succeed. Well, anyone interested in social equity has a healthy distaste and distrust for the concept of the level playing field. So my starting point was to say, are there learners who are already advantaged in today's digital world, or disadvantaged, that are more or less likely to succeed in these great online courses that we're building? And does that mean that even when following these principles, we could be sort of inadvertently disadvantaging some learners? And what can we do about that? So I'm going to start with this handsome man who is my academic crush. This is the French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu. Sadly, he died before I got the chance to tell him that I love him. Bourdieu's work was, and I'm probably massacring his name as well, so I apologize to French speakers in the room. Bourdieu's work was primarily about the dynamics of power in society, especially the subtle ways in which power is transmitted and the ways social order is maintained within and across generations. So he believed that an individual's position in society is determined by more than just money. He identified 3 key forms of capital that people possess: economic, cultural, and social capital. And I've just realized what's happened to these slides. All the bits that weren't bolded are now bolded. So the important stuff is not bolded. So this is not a good online course. We'll just roll with it. Apologies for that. And Bourdieu, of course, he was a pessimist. So he believed that because the wealthy and the powerful accumulate all these forms of capital, and they can pass them on to their children, the elite will always reproduce itself. So these are the capitals that he started with. An economic capital is essentially the literal cash in your wallet. It's how much money you have, how much assets you have. Cultural capital is the knowledge, skills, and education that confer status in society. So we might think of that as kind of cultural fit, what the kind of cultural fit you need to succeed. And social capital is about your network and connections. And this is the old adage that's it's not what you know, it's who you know. And the several kinds of capital are interrelated. So if I think about my work, the most obvious example is that if you have economic capital, you have money, you can pay tuition fees and you can get a degree. And then you get the cultural capital that comes with a degree. And if the system works in this way as it should, you may be able to get a better job. And then you get even more economic capital. You also, through your degree, might get a better social network or a more influential social network. And guess what? You can use that to get a better job and more money. So this is how the concept of capitals kind of works for Budja. He didn't write a lot about technology, but there's loads of academic research that's followed him that's really thought about these concepts and how economic and social advantage and disadvantage play out now in a digital world. And so, while access to the internet was once considered the sole digital divide, and it's still really important, right? There are huge amounts of population around the world that don't have access to the internet. We can also see that access alone doesn't lead to equality or advancement. So users are further divided by how they use the technology, what they use it for, and the extent of the benefits they receive. So are they using it to receive better benefits? And so thinking about access to technologies, digital skills, and the ability to leverage them as a form of capital can give us another lens through which we can understand the different experiences and outcomes our learners might have. So I explored 6 major frameworks for digital capital in my research, so you don't have to. And I made a thing. It is a very ugly thing. You probably can't read it properly on the screen, but you can use that QR code to get access to this. It will still be ugly, but it should be readable. This is my framework for understanding digital capital. And what I've done here is try to draw together the different dimensions of digital capital so you can start to see the difference between a learner with a lot of it and a learner who doesn't have very much of it. And I'll talk you through what that means in a moment. You can also, on that QR code, access all of the long list of resources and things that I looked at if you'd like to do a bit more digging. This is now really unattractive on this slide, I do apologize. This is what a learner with high levels of digital capital is likely to be. They're likely to have access to multiple devices and strong, consistent access to the internet. They can buy whatever technology they need to get along in life. They possess and use the digital skills required to improve employability and to gain advantage, and they probably have sophisticated online behavior and present as technologically competent. They'll be highly motivated to seek information and make use of it in society, and they have a social network that knows how to use technology to its advantage and is proactive in sharing that access and knowledge back with the individual. By contrast, someone with low levels of digital capital, who may be at a digital disadvantage, will have limited access to technology, which may include shared devices, devices in poor repair, and limited or inconsistent access to the internet. And anyone that tried to deliver education during the pandemic remotely is likely to have discovered many things about their learners and the home environments and the technology that they have during that process that they didn't know before. And I know there were many teachers working with young people who had, maybe one mobile phone in the house that they were trying to learn remotely on. So we can often forget this, but this is definitely real for many of our learners. And they may be able to use the internet, or they can use the internet, but probably with limited scope or effectiveness. They may have little or no technology expertise in their networks. They don't have anybody to ask that they feel comfortable with if they don't understand how to do something. And they may not understand norms in digital spaces, especially those which are professionally oriented. So how do we go about thinking, what does this mean for our online courses? So I use the framework because I'm working in a theoretical capacity to ask the experts. So I asked the academic literature a few key questions. Could learners with different levels of digital capital experience online learning differently? Could it have a meaningful impact on their experience and outcomes? And perhaps the answer to that feels obvious. These 2 questions may be even more important. Are there particular aspects of our online pedagogies that may be problematic? And if so, how could we as educators, learning designers, community of learning managers mitigate any of those inequalities? So once again, these were the principles I was looking at when I thought about how people might be advantaged or disadvantaged in our online learning courses. And I came up with a few key areas that I think it's just worth us remembering as a group. So firstly, thinking about the notion of being learner-centered, and I think this is something that many of us hold really dear as a really important principle when we're designing a course, and it certainly speaks to the kind of social constructivist foundation of Moodle, something that we all think very carefully about, and that is that in order to be learner-centered, you need to meet learners where they are. When we're teaching students online, sometimes we make assumptions that they've chosen to learn online because they are digitally savvy, because they have those skills and that expertise. And those assumptions can trip us up. So one of the things I'm suggesting is that we just really sort of think about that as we're looking at our cohorts of learners, whatever context they're in, and maybe try to make fewer assumptions about how good they might be with the technology or how much they might know and understand. And that can be quite hard if this is your day-to-day job, right? Because you know it and you love it and you know how to do all the things. But trying to think about that for our learners. They may also have, and this is from the research again, less experience in managing their time and focus independently in information-rich environments. So an online course, no matter how well designed, can be quite confusing. It can feel quite overwhelming for people with low levels of digital capital. And so clarity and consistency in the structure and the signposting are key. That's also good design, right? We all aim for that, but it means a huge amount to those students who find this area more challenging. And the piece that I find most interesting in this area is that they're likely to have lower levels of self-confidence in their academic performance, so low self-efficacy, we might call it. And they may be less comfortable with the idea of having agency over their learning. So again, those good online learning principles are often underpinned by learner agency. We believe in that. We think it's important to give learners choices. But that can be overwhelming for someone who has not got high levels of digital capital. And so we need to try and avoid learning choices becoming a burden for them. Essentially, learners with lower levels of digital capital need a clear path forward. And that doesn't mean there can't be choices, but thinking about clarity, consistency, and providing that path can give them a route to learning that maybe other learners don't need. Teaching presence, and again, we're thinking here about not necessarily having a teacher in the virtual room, that might not be the design of your class, but in how you have that presence throughout the design and facilitation of the course. We quite often use things like forums and other collaborative activities when we're working in the online space, especially if we're working asynchronously. And again, learners with low levels of digital capital may have less experience of navigating those digital spaces. They may not understand the norms as well as other learners do, especially if it's their first time learning online, if they don't have that experience in their network. And so they might be less successful or confident in courses that require online participation. So that's not to say that you shouldn't require it, but there's a real role for instructors and facilitators either in the design or the delivery of the course, to enhance their outcomes by providing clear instructions, modeling expectations, and facilitating online discussions inclusively. So one thing I often see is there'll be a forum, it'll say everybody has to make a post in answer to this question by this timeline. What do you mean by a post? Like, what should it contain? How long should it be? Should it be referenced? These are the kind of questions that someone who is not used to this environment might have. Others might have them too, but they may be more confident in just posting anyway, whereas a learner with lower digital capital might be inhibited by that. And then facilitating those discussions inclusively. So meeting your learners where they are in that conversation, if you are doing sort of facilitation, if you have groups that you're running, and trying to draw out what it is that they're trying to say to you, rather than just relying on the format of their message as a marker of their quality. The final area is the one that I think is the most problematic for us when we think about social equity, and that's how we build community. And there's a couple of key reasons why this is challenging. Learners with low levels of digital capital may have less capacity to shape the community because they're focused on monitoring their own behavior. So many of us will have experienced this in social settings. If you're with a group of people that you don't know very well, you don't know how they feel about you, you're involved in the conversation, but a big part of your brain is thinking, how am I coming across? Am I doing this right? Do they like me? And that's the kind of thing that will often be in the minds of people with lower levels of digital capital as they're going through these online courses. And that limits them because they're not able to spend the same amount of time perhaps in that forum, in that space, in that online course, but a lot of that time is spent thinking and worrying about themselves. And so they're not able to be as confident and as active in shaping the community. I mean, the good news is that there's evidence that underrepresented voices can be heard more effectively in online learning contexts, especially if there's an asynchronous element where it gives people a chance to think and practice. But learners still need that psychological safety and a sense of belonging to realize this in the community. So again, some of this comes back to effective teaching presence, how you make that learning community feel safe, how you nurture it, and how you kind of develop the sense of confidence that people might have in engaging in that community. The one thing we can't get away from, though, is that learners who find this more difficult will have to learn how to participate effectively in real time while their counterparts do not. And that's the nature of the advantage and disadvantage that we see here. So what are some things we might be able to do to mitigate that piece? The things that I have considered really is around formative assessment, so giving them the opportunity to practice, and of course there's loads of other reasons why formative assessment is really helpful, but giving them feedback in time for them to be able to build up that confidence so that they can engage in the community. And if there's any way to provide mentoring or advising services, depending on your context, this may be something that you have central or local support for, or something that you can develop as a peer-based project, that can really help build the gap. So the takeaway here is that learners with low levels of digital capital will need support in understanding the cultural expectations in an online learning community. So what can you do about this? I would love you to think about the digital capital framework that I've developed in the context of your learners. Does it resonate? Do you think this is something that makes sense to you, that you can work with? How could you apply this thinking to your course design and facilitation? And this is a Moodle conference, so how should your Moodle LMS enable you to do that? I'd love to get your thoughts and critique on the framework. It's a starting place, not an end point. It's still very conceptual. What research should I do to test the concept, and what resources could help move it from theory to practice? So if you're interested in exploring this further with me, again, there's a QR code. You can grab the framework. Please do reach out to me, and I'd love to have more conversations about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz, very much. That was an excellent presentation. We've got some time for questions if anyone's got any questions they'd like to ask. We've got some microphones, if you could just wait until they come. We've got one up the back here.
Hi, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I like the concept. Two questions, I guess. One is, Bourdieu talks a lot about practice and everyday habitus and all that kind of stuff. So, and then you talk about using formative exercises for getting people used to the cultural norms of the online interactions. So I'm thinking in terms of your research, or I don't know, an idea, maybe you thought of already, is looking at those specific different types of practices and the number of practices, and if, I don't know, empirically, if you could do a whole bunch or not, but that would be one way to link it in with Bourdieu's theory, maybe, and that's just, I guess, a suggestion. And then a question, is there any insights for people, because you talk about cultural norms, and if you're trying to train people who are not confident in digital technology, they have this mindset, sometimes I'm not a techie, it's this sort of fixed mindset, which has a psychological name I can't remember, but they sort of, one theory says that they believe that they are fixed in a certain mindset and therefore they're not techie, so they can't learn, right? And so people usually say, oh, just try it out, you can't break it, and so on. And that's a norm among lots of people here in this room, probably. You just click away and try things out, trial and error. So do you have any insights in how, apart from online learning, but just in training people, that you could change that culture or insert a new cultural mindset somehow. So insert some of that digital cultural capital, I guess. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So it's great to meet a fellow Bourdieu lover, and I am excited that you mentioned the word habitus. But in terms of the formative assessment piece, I mean, the research that I've looked at and in my practice, what I think is most important about using that as a tool to enable people to develop their digital capital is the timing of that. And doing that as early as you can, which obviously learners often never want to do because they're like, we haven't learned anything yet. But giving them opportunities really early to practice, and for those to be like low stakes. So, having a few small activities where they can practice these skills and not setting it up as though that's the purpose for that, but having it obviously very connected to the content, but something that gives them a sort of ramp up through the course. So that would be my first kind of recommendation based on practice. And then the second point, I think, and let me know if I've missed what you're saying here, something around people feeling that they are or are not tech savvy and how you kind of shift that mindset. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And there's often the reverse of that as well, where people feel sometimes very confident and yet they don't have the skills that you need them to have. So from my perspective as a program designer or a learning designer, I would really look at how we embed the development of those skills in the content. So that variety of things that you're asking them to do, and again, that sort of ramp up, starting with things that are easier for the whole cohort, and seeing where people are and how they get on with that. And then if you want to do more complex activities that require more digital skills, that you you embed that later in the course. And there's also, and again, it depends on your context, I think there's a real role here for peer-to-peer work. That can be hard to do, and again, often in HE, I come from a business school background, and we make students do lots of group projects, and they hate it. They never want to do it, but it does give them opportunities to have to see what other people are doing and how they're doing it. In a more informal setting. So if there's a way in which you can do that in your online environment, I think that's quite useful too. But I would love to chat more to you about this. I think it's some really interesting avenues for exploration here in practice. Thanks.
So we've got another question up over in the corner there. To your, oh yeah, I'll take it. That one up.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I work in an organization with students, and these students they have a hard time with digital stuff. And then eventually it will work and they're open, but then a long time of no e-learning, and maybe a month or 6, they have to come back.
Right.
And it feels like everything has been resetted. Do you have any tips, or have you already discovered something, if there's a long period of time, how to revoke that digital self-esteem maybe?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I think that really ties in with the concept of digital capital, because in that break, when they're not learning with you, they are back in their regular environment, which, as we kind of covered today, is likely to be an environment where they're not surrounded by people that are digitally savvy, and so they're not having that kind of continual feedback and skill development. It is quite tricky, and I think it's sort of almost, it's going back to that you go back to that traditional school model as a school teacher, and everyone comes back after the 6 or 8 or 10 weeks break in the summer, and it's like they've gone backwards a year. I think those breaks in learning can be really difficult to manage. If you have the opportunity in your course design, I think it's really nice to have a refresher at the start, which again is content focused, because you want students to think that this is purely part of their content, and it should be, and that's how they contextualize it to their environment. But that actually sort of reintroduces some of those skills and those ways of working that you built the last time you saw them, the last module. So if they got really fluent with using digital forums or with using collaboration tools or any of the other things you were doing, make the first few activities you do when you see them again using those tools. Lower your expectations a little bit and then build them up. And I think typically they will accelerate quite quickly from that point, but I would think they would need that refresher. So that would be my suggestion.
Hi there.
Hi.
Yeah, that was great. So our digital infrastructure that we support is around 50 different Moodle sites. Some of those are colleges where there are younger people, but often there's self-directed learning, and a lot of the people who engage with that are much older.
Yeah.
Now, that's something that was connecting for me with the low digital capital that you were talking about, but I was thinking about this aging generation who really struggle with technology, and I feel like their low digital capital will be because of their age, because of their lack of digital skills. And I just wondered if you'd done research on that as part of this, older people.
I haven't done research on that, but I think that's absolutely fascinating, and I do agree. I've worked a lot with professional audiences, and we often make the assumption that professional learners, again, are going to be very digitally savvy because they're out there in the world, and we're all using technology all of the time. But when you work with executives, quite often they're at a point in their career where they have other people doing these things for them, and so they don't always have the digital skills that you expect. And I feel like that also would apply to an older audience. So I haven't done any research on that. I'd love to do that, and I'd love to follow up with you. I wonder if there is something there around the way in which you explain the activities, the way in which you kind of set that up, which might be different for that audience. Do they need different visual cues to help to understand, for example, the activities? Do they need video-based content? It would be great to do some work on that. I'd love to explore that a bit further.
So we have time for one more question, just up the back here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Hi, Liz. My name is Sophia. I'm part of the United Nations, and I really like your research. I think it's a really wonderful job you've done. I was wondering, first of all, it was really nice that you looked into the digital capital from all the sorts of capitals, which is really important. I was wondering, do you have any plans to weave in the digital inclusion aspect to your research? We are like 30% of the world is offline still, very low bandwidth, and even in the places where there is connection and there is like more digital inclusion, a lot of, let's say, of my colleagues, me, myself, were not tuned in to what we need to do for the learning to be accessible even to the neighborhood next door. So do you have any plans maybe on expanding your framework for that part? Thanks.
Yeah, again, a really fascinating area. You'll see on the framework that I've mapped it against the sort of 3 levels of digital divide. So that the assumption is that at the bottom of this framework, you already have access to the internet. So it kind of starts there, but then maps against those different ways in which we can be divided digitally. But I haven't done any more in-depth work on that, and I think that would be really great to explore further and look at how when we get to the point of people having access, but perhaps having limited access, or perhaps having limited access to skill development for advancement, see how the framework applies in those scenarios, and that would be great. And I'd love to chat to you afterwards about whether we can work on something like that. Great, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Liz. That was an amazing presentation.
Thank you, everyone.